My friends, I want to tell you about a boardroom moment in my early 60s that I still think about regularly, not because of what I said, but because of what I noticed happening in the room while I said it. I had just informed my fellow board members of a non-profit I served that I would be stepping down from my position at the end of the year, a decision I had made carefully and was entirely at peace with. And then, almost without meaning to, I began explaining myself. I described my reasoning in considerable detail, my age, my other commitments, my genuine gratitude for the years I had served, offering paragraph after paragraph of justification for a decision that required none whatsoever. I remember, quite vividly, watching the room's energy shift as I spoke. The longer I explained, the more questions arose, the more the group seemed to feel entitled to weigh in on a decision I had already made, the more the entire conversation began to resemble a negotiation over whether my reasoning was sufficient rather than a simple, respectful acknowledgement of information I had shared. By the time I finally stopped talking, several members were offering counterarguments, suggesting alternatives, gently pressing me to reconsider, none of which would have occurred, I came to realize only afterward, had I simply stated my decision plainly and allowed it to stand on its own. I want to be honest with you that this was not an isolated incident. It was, I began to recognize over the following months, a pattern I had practiced across my entire adult life, in nearly every domain, offering lengthy, detailed justification for decisions that were genuinely mine to make, decisions that required no one else's approval or understanding before they could stand. And the more I studied this pattern in myself, and later in others, the more I came to understand something that has fundamentally reshaped how I move through the world in my later years. Every unnecessary explanation I offered was quietly handing over a piece of authority that had, in truth, always belonged entirely to me, inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny, negotiation, and second-guessing that a simple, unexplained statement would never have invited in the first place. Today I want to share with you everything I have come to understand about this particular pattern, why explanation so reliably functions as a quiet transfer of power rather than the neutral courtesy most of us believe it to be, and the many different corners of daily life where I have watched the same principle prove itself true, again and again, once I finally learned to recognize it clearly. The single insight underlying everything I am about to share is this: every explanation offered for a decision that required none is an implicit invitation for the listener to judge, negotiate, or overturn that decision, and the moment you stop offering unnecessary explanations, you stop extending that invitation, reclaiming an authority over your own choices that excessive explanation had quietly been giving away all along. For most of my life, I believed that explaining myself reflected consideration, respect, and basic decency toward the people around me. I finally understood, in my 60s, that unnecessary explanation very often accomplishes the opposite of what I intended, communicating uncertainty rather than confidence, and inviting exactly the scrutiny and negotiation that a plain, unexplained statement of fact would never have invited. Everything that follows is simply this one insight, appearing across the many different rooms of my life where it eventually proved itself true. The first place this insight proved itself was in that boardroom moment I have already described, where a simple, three-sentence resignation announcement, delivered without extensive justification, would have almost certainly been received as a respected, settled decision rather than the extended negotiation my own over-explanation inadvertently invited. I have since tested this directly in subsequent situations, offering brief, plain statements of decisions rather than lengthy justifications, and I have observed, consistently, that these plain statements are received with considerably more immediate respect and considerably less pushback than my old habit of extensive explanation ever produced. The second place this insight proved itself was in declining invitations from friends and family, where I discovered that a simple "I won't be able to make it" was received entirely differently than my old habit of offering an elaborate excuse and apology. The elaborate excuse, I came to understand, implicitly suggested that my absence required justification sufficient to satisfy the other person's approval, an implicit suggestion that frequently produced follow-up questions and gentle pressure to reconsider, while the plain, simple decline was generally accepted immediately and without further discussion. The third place this insight proved itself was in setting a financial boundary with a family member requesting assistance, where I discovered that a brief, unexplained "I'm not able to help with that right now" produced considerably less negotiation than my old pattern of offering detailed financial justifications for my decision. The detailed justification, I recognized, had always implicitly invited a counterargument addressing each specific point I raised, while the plain, unexplained decline left considerably less room for this kind of negotiated pushback. The fourth place this insight proved itself was in declining to share my opinion on a divisive family matter, where I discovered that simply saying "I'd rather not weigh in on that" was received with considerably more ease than my old habit of offering a lengthy explanation of why I preferred to remain neutral. The lengthy explanation, I came to understand, had always implicitly suggested that my neutrality required sufficient justification to be considered legitimate, an implicit suggestion that frequently produced pressure to abandon this neutrality altogether. The fifth place this insight proved itself was in ending a phone call earlier than the other person expected, where I discovered that a simple "I need to go now" produced considerably less friction than my old habit of offering an elaborate excuse about why I could not continue the conversation longer. The elaborate excuse, I recognized, had always implicitly invited the other person to suggest why my stated reason might not actually require ending the call quite so soon, while the plain, unexplained statement left no comparable opening for this kind of negotiation. The sixth place this insight proved itself was in changing my mind about a previously stated preference, where I discovered that simply saying "I've changed my mind about that" was received with considerably more ease than my old habit of offering a lengthy justification for why my new preference was reasonable. The lengthy justification, I came to understand, had always implicitly suggested that changing my mind required sufficient defense to be considered legitimate, an implicit suggestion that frequently produced pushback specifically challenging the adequacy of my stated reasoning. The seventh place this insight proved itself was in declining a request for my time from a local community organization, where I discovered that a brief that won't work for my schedule produced considerably less negotiation than my old habit of offering a detailed account of exactly why my schedule was full. The detailed account, I recognized, had always implicitly invited the organizer to propose an alternative arrangement addressing each specific obstacle I mentioned, while the plain, unexplained decline left considerably less room for this kind of point-by-point negotiation. The eighth place this insight proved itself was in setting a boundary with a neighbor regarding noise from his property, where I discovered that a simple, direct statement of my concern, without extensive justification for why the noise bothered me, was received with considerably more respect than my old habit of offering an elaborate explanation of my particular sensitivities. The elaborate explanation, I came to understand, had always implicitly invited scrutiny of whether my particular sensitivities were sufficiently reasonable to warrant his accommodation, while the plain, unexplained statement of my preference left considerably less room for this kind of challenge. The ninth place this insight proved itself was in declining to attend an extended family gathering during a period when I genuinely needed rest, where I discovered that simply stating I would not be attending, without an elaborate account of my health and energy levels, was received with considerably more grace than my old habit of extensive justification. The extensive justification, I recognized, had always implicitly invited family members to assess whether my stated reasons were sufficiently serious to excuse my absence, while the plain, unexplained decline left no comparable opening for this kind of judgment. The 10th place this insight proved itself was in setting a boundary around unsolicited advice from a well-meaning friend, where I discovered that simply saying "I appreciate that, but I've already decided how I'll handle this" produced considerably less continued pushback than my old habit of explaining in detail why her advice did not apply to my particular situation. The detailed explanation, I came to understand, had always implicitly invited her to address each specific point and continue advocating for her original suggestion, while the plain, unexplained statement of my settled decision left considerably less room for this kind of ongoing negotiation. The 11th place this insight proved itself was in declining a second helping of food at a family gathering, where I discovered that a simple "no thank you, I'm satisfied" was received without further comment, while my old habit of explaining my dietary choices in detail frequently invited unsolicited commentary and gentle pressure to reconsider. This small, seemingly trivial example taught me that this principle applies at every scale, from the most significant life decisions to the smallest, most ordinary daily choices. The 12th place this insight proved itself was in setting a boundary around my own time with my adult children regarding childcare requests, where I discovered that a brief I won't be able to help with it this week produced considerably less negotiation than my old habit of offering a detailed account of my own competing obligations. The detailed account, I recognized, had always implicitly invited my children to weigh whether my competing obligations were sufficiently important to outweigh their own genuine need, while the plain, unexplained decline left considerably less room for this kind of comparative judgment. The 13th thing I understood, considering all of these examples together honestly, was that the discomfort I felt in offering a plain, unexplained statement rather than an extensive justification was itself worth examining closely, since this discomfort reflected an old, deeply held belief that my own decisions required external validation before they could be considered legitimate. Recognizing this underlying belief clearly helped me understand that my habitual over-explanation was never really about genuine courtesy toward others. It was about an old, unexamined need for my own decisions to be approved before I would allow myself to feel settled in having made them. The 14th place this insight proved itself was in a professional negotiation during my final working years, where I discovered that stating my required terms plainly, without an extensive account of the personal circumstances justifying them, produced a considerably stronger negotiating position than my old habit of explaining my reasoning in exhaustive detail. The exhaustive explanation, I came to understand, had always functioned as an implicit invitation for the other party to challenge each individual point, weakening my overall position by giving them numerous small footholds for negotiation that a plain, confident statement of my terms would never have offered them in the first place. The 15th place this insight proved itself was in a doctor's appointment where I stated plainly that I wished to pursue a particular treatment approach, rather than offering an extensive justification for why I preferred it over the alternatives my doctor had mentioned. I discovered that this plain statement of my genuine preference, offered confidently rather than defensively, produced a considerably more collaborative and respectful conversation than my old habit of over-explaining my reasoning, which had often inadvertently signaled uncertainty that invited my doctor to press harder for the alternative she may have privately preferred. The 16th place this insight proved itself was in declining a request from my church community to take on an additional leadership role, where I discovered that a brief, warm decline, offered without extensive justification, was received with considerably more immediate acceptance than my old pattern of explaining at length why I did not currently have capacity for additional responsibility. The extensive explanation, I recognized, had always implicitly suggested that my capacity was a matter open for discussion and negotiation, while the plain, warm decline communicated a settled decision that required no further consideration from anyone else involved. The 17th place this insight proved itself was in choosing not to attend a particular social gathering that I anticipated would involve considerable tension with certain attendees, where I discovered that simply saying I would not be attending, without detailing my specific concerns about the tension involved, protected both my own privacy and the general atmosphere of the gathering considerably more effectively than a fuller explanation would have. This particular instance taught me that plain, unexplained statements sometimes serve not only my own authority, but also the genuine well-being and privacy of everyone else involved in a given situation. The 18th place this insight proved itself was in setting a boundary with an old friend regarding a recurring pattern of behavior I no longer wished to tolerate, where I discovered that a brief, clear statement of the boundary itself, without an extensive account of every specific instance justifying it, was received with considerably more genuine reflection on her part than my old habit of building an exhaustive case before ever stating the actual boundary. The exhaustive case, I came to understand, had always functioned more as a debate to be won than a boundary to be respected, while the plain, clear statement communicated a settled decision that invited genuine reflection rather than defensive counterargument. And the 19th and final form this single insight takes, the one that ties every other form together, is simply this: your reasons are yours, and they do not require anyone else's approval to be sufficient. The moment you understand this clearly, the compulsion to explain begins to loosen, and what remains in its place is a quiet, settled authority over your own life that no amount of explanation could ever have produced. For most of my life, I believed that thorough, considerate explanation represented good character and genuine respect for others. I finally understood, through repeated, direct experience across every domain of my life, that this thorough explanation very often accomplished the opposite of what I intended, quietly inviting exactly the negotiation and scrutiny that a plain, confident statement would never have invited in the first place. My friends, I want to be honest with you that unlearning this particular habit required considerable, ongoing practice, and I want to be equally honest that I still occasionally catch myself launching into an unnecessary explanation before I manage to catch and correct the impulse. Decades of practiced habit do not disappear simply because I have finally named the underlying pattern clearly. What has changed is that I now recognize this impulse the moment it arises, possessing, through considerable practice, a genuine choice about whether to follow it into another lengthy justification or simply let my plain statement stand on its own. I think often of that boardroom moment, and how differently the entire conversation might have unfolded had I simply said, plainly and without elaboration, that I would be stepping down at year's end, thanking the group for the opportunity to serve, and allowing the statement to stand without further comment. I have since tested this exact scenario, quite deliberately, in numerous other situations, and I have observed, with remarkable consistency, that the plain, unexplained statement produces considerably more respect and considerably less negotiation than the elaborate justification I once believed was required of a decent, considerate person. I want to share one further reflection before we close, something that took me considerable time to fully understand. This particular practice is not about withholding genuine information from people who have a legitimate right to it, nor is it about becoming secretive or evasive with people you love. There remain many situations in my life where genuine, full explanation serves real connection and understanding, and I continue to offer this fuller explanation freely in exactly those situations. What I learned to recognize, and what I hope I have communicated clearly to you today, is the specific difference between explanation freely offered because it serves genuine connection, and explanation compulsively offered because some old, unexamined part of me still believed my own decisions required outside approval before they could be considered legitimate. Learning to distinguish between these two very different motivations, rather than eliminating explanation altogether, has been the true heart of everything I have shared with you today. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, this same habit of offering extensive explanation for decisions that genuinely require none, I want you to know that releasing this habit does not require becoming curt, cold, or dismissive toward the people in your life. It simply requires recognizing that your own genuine reasons, whatever they may be, do not require anyone else's approval to be sufficient, and that the moment you stop offering this approval-seeking explanation, You stop extending an invitation for negotiation and scrutiny that a plain, confident statement would never have extended in the first place. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own particular pattern of unnecessary explanation and gives you the courage to practice, gently and patiently, letting your own plain statements stand on their own. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Trust your own reasons, even when you choose not to share them fully. And reclaim, one plain, unexplained statement at a time, the quiet authority over your own life that excessive explanation may have been giving away for far longer than you ever realized. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay confident, stay plain-spoken, and remember, your reasons were always sufficient. They never actually needed anyone else's approval at all. Thank you for watching.